Hi, Mr. C back here. Hi, Mr. C back here in the shop. What I'd like to talk to you about is the face frame. As you remember in our last segment, I went ahead and cut all the different parts out to exact size and showed you how to do that. Excuse me. As you're aware, I'm just cutting out the face frame for one cabinet. But in a cabinet shop or a millworking case scenario or something in a production shop, what you'd find is they'd find out how many parts they need to make that are that long, set up a stop block, and just cut all of them. For instance, if they were cutting all the face frame pieces that go vertically and horizontally, they will set up a specific length and then cut all of them. So let's say there's 40 of them or 50 of them or 60 of them. They would cut all of those at the same exact time. That way they can ensure they're all exactly the same length. Okay? So now with that being said, what I'd like to do is just talk to you a little bit about our next step. Our next step, what I've done here is I've just basically placed the pieces for the face frame just so you could see what they are or what it looks like. This is what the face frame will look like once it's done and put together. But like I said, the next step is for us to sand it. And what I've done here is I've taken every piece and I've marked pencil lines across the surfaces because these are the surfaces that have to be sanded, okay? Now, they have to be sanded with a heavy grit, a medium grit, and then a refined grit. And we'll go through that in greater detail in a little bit here. But so I've marked all of these. And the reason why I've marked these is so that you can see basically once I've gone over the surface, what areas have been hit, what areas have not been hit. Unfortunately, your eye has not been trained to see the milling marks that were left from either a planer, a joiner, or a table saw. So basically what I do, especially with beginning students, is I have them take a pencil and strike a pencil line all the way across the surface. That way we know if it's been sanded or not. And we do this with every single grit. Now, when you do sand your pieces, it's important to understand this. Right now, this piece has not been sanded at all, okay? And right now, there's a bunch of milling marks that look like little, I guess you could say waves, or there's like an indent where it's curved or scalloped. And there's a high and low mark all the way up and down this whole thing, left from the planer, which is the last piece of equipment that it went through or touched the surface, okay? So what we want to do is we want to remove those so that way when we spray our finish, it's not seen. And on this particular piece, it's going to have a stain on it as well as a top coat to protect that. Well, our first grit that we're going to use is an 80 grit, which is a relatively coarse grit, and that's going to take care of all those milling marks as far as those scallops or those waves that you might see, all right? Now, like I said, your eye has not been trained to see this, but over time, you will pick this up and you will recognize those different marks that are left by different milling machines depending on what they are. So what we want to do is we want to mark all this, and then we will sand this until we remove the pencil lines. Once we remove the pencil lines, typically you've removed those milling marks that have been left by the machine. Now, one thing also that needs to be said is if I'm going to sand this surface with an 80 grit sandpaper, which is the very first grit that I'm going to start with, the scratch pattern that is going to be left in this piece of material is going to be very aggressive and very deep. Yes, if I took 80 grit and sanded it, I could get the milling marks off. And then if I went to 220 grit, yes, I can make it very, very smooth. But the problem is the scratch pattern that was left with 80 grit is so deep and so coarse that you're not going to remove that coarseness, and it's still going to remain that deep as far as the scratching on the surface. So you're going to see that in a finished product if you don't sand from one grit to the next grit in the appropriate stepped procedure. Also, after you sand a piece of material with, let's say, 80 grit, like I'm going to do here, is the sawdust or the dust that's been left over from the sanding disc is relatively coarse. You want to brush this off or blow this off with compressed air between different grits, so that way you're not just forcing that back into the same surface as far as that grit pattern. So with this, I have this piece marked, okay? And I'm going to go ahead, and I have this plugged in already, and of course this is in the off position. This is a PSA pad, which is a pressure sensitive adhesive sanding disc. This is 80 grit. I have in the back side of this I have it set at 6, which is the highest speed because this is variable speed. And I want to move across this whole surface at 8 feet per minute, which is a relatively slow speed, okay? And to protect the cord, I will go ahead and place this over my shoulder. I have one hand on the barrel and one hand on the handle. But as you can see, I'm probably not gonna be able to keep this down. So what I have done is I have brought over a couple clamps. I'm gonna go ahead and clamp this one down, and I'm pretty sure it's not gonna move at this point. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go ahead and turn this on. I do have the sander on the surface, okay? When I turn this on, I'm gonna go ahead and sand this, and I'm gonna go across the surface at 8 feet per minute. I'm only gonna go about halfway, then I'll stop, and I'll move my clamp over the other side, as you can see here, okay? So here we go. As I turn it off, I'm going to pick it up. I'll wait for the disc to come to complete stop before I place it down. And I set this here. I take this clamp off this side, I rotate this piece. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and start on this side. Now we're waiting for it to stop. I can do it this way, or I can flip this over. Now I have my marks on this side. I can go ahead, place one clamp down here, one clamp down here, now the reason why I'm putting this cord over my shoulder is so that way I don't cut into it. So coming up around my neck and over, and I'm going to be fine where I'm not going to run into the bit, or I'm sorry, run into the sanding disc. Remember, you want to keep your hands 4 inches away at all times whenever you're using a sanding disc. Okay, so let's go ahead and finish off this piece. Now what I'm going to do is wait for it to stop. Go ahead and clamp this side down. this side down, and now I can finish off the ends. I'll wait for the disc to come to a stop before I place it down on the material. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and finish off. Now this has come to a complete stop. I'm going to set this in the center of the bench so that way it can't be knocked on the floor. I take this clamp off. I take this clamp off. Now this surface, I've removed all the milling marks on this side and this side, but it still leaves the edges here for me to go ahead and sand. Now you have to be very, very careful on this portion because you do not want to remove too much material. So what I want to do is I want to take this and open up